A ruthless billionaire, a mysterious beggar woman, a love that defied all odds. When Damian Carter loses everything, the only person who stands by him is Elena, a woman with a past as shocking as his fall. Through pain, redemption, and passion, love changes them forever. Will he fight for her before it's too late? The city skyline stretched endlessly before Damian Carter as he stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling glass window of his penthouse. Below him, New York's glittering lights pulsed like veins of gold in the night, mirroring the power he wielded. A billionaire at the top of his game, untouchable, ruthless, feared. Yet, inside, he felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. He turned away from the breathtaking view and walked toward the bar, pouring himself a glass of expensive whiskey. Another deal closed, another billion added to his empire. People worshipped him, feared him, envied him. Women threw themselves at him, not for love, but for what he could give them. Love. A smirk curled his lips. That was for fools. He had learned young that love was nothing but a transaction. His father had hammered it into his mind. The only thing in this world that matters is power, Damian. Money is the only real god. Love makes you weak. His mother had loved his father, and in return, his father had crushed her. Since then, Damian had never allowed himself to feel anything. His fiancée Vanessa Lancaster, the stunning, elegant socialite with the perfect pedigree, was the ideal match. Beautiful, poised, well-connected. But love? Number She was just another part of his empire. Another calculated decision. Tonight, he was supposed to meet her at a high-profile gala. Another evening of fake smiles, champagne, and empty conversations. But something inside him felt restless, as if something was missing, and then fate intervened. The streets were wet with evening drizzle as Damian's sleek black Bentley rolled to a stop at a red light. His eyes remained fixed on his phone, scanning last-minute emails. Then, a movement, a presence. His gaze flickered outside the car window, landing on a woman standing on the sidewalk. She wasn't like the others. Dressed in tattered clothes, an oversized shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders, she looked fragile yet dignified. Her long, dark hair fell in loose waves, damp from the rain. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold, deep, knowing, haunting. Not the eyes of a beggar, the eyes of someone who had lived and lost. Most beggars would reach out, plead for money, murmur words of gratitude if he tossed them $100 bill. But she didn't. Instead, she just watched him, studied him. And then, in a voice soft, yet powerful, she said something that sent a strange shiver down his spine. "You're the poorest man I've ever seen." His jaw tightened. He turned his full attention to her now, his icy blue eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" A small, almost amused smile touched her lips. "A man who owns the world but has no love is the poorest of all." Damian felt something unfamiliar and unsettling, twist inside his chest. For a second, he just stared at her, as if trying to decipher whether she was insane or profound. The city roared around them, honking cars, distant laughter, the drizzle turning into a light mist. Yet in that moment, it was just the two of them. A billionaire in his luxury car, a beggar woman standing in the rain. Two worlds that were never meant to collide. His lips curled into a slow, amused smirk, shaking off the strange feeling. "And what makes you think I have no love?" The woman tilted her head slightly as if peering right into his soul. Her eyes never wavered, never looked away. They held him captive. "Because your eyes are empty." A sharp honk from the car behind him jolted Damian back to reality. The traffic light had turned green. Without another word, he pressed his foot on the gas. The car surged forward, leaving her behind. Yet, even as he drove away, her words stayed with him, echoing in the silence. Heart-touched, unwillingly. The gala was in full swing by the time Damian arrived, a luxurious ballroom bathed in golden light. Women in glittering gowns, men in tailored suits. Champagne flowed, and empty laughter filled the air. This was his world, yet, for the first time in years, he felt disconnected. Vanessa glided toward him, every bit the goddess she was. She leaned in, brushing a slow, teasing kiss against his cheek. "You're late," she murmured. Normally he would have smirked, whispered something charming, let his hands slide around her waist. But tonight, he felt nothing, because all he could think about was that woman's voice. "You're the poorest man I've ever seen." Vanessa linked her arm through his, oblivious to his distracted mind. "What's wrong? You seem off tonight." Off? He wasn't off. He was haunted by a pair of dark, knowing eyes, by a voice that refused to leave him alone, a billionaire surrounded by everything money could buy. Yet, for the first time in his life, he was starting to wonder, had he ever truly been rich at all? The following days should have been like any other for Damian Carter, waking up in his penthouse, sealing multi-million-dollar deals, attending high-profile meetings, and indulging in luxuries only a billionaire could afford. But something was different. The words of the mysterious woman on the street refused to leave his mind. No matter how hard he tried to dismiss them, they echoed in his thoughts, in his silence, in his reflection, when he looked in the mirror. A man who owns the world but has no love is the poorest of all. At first, he convinced himself it was nothing, just an odd encounter, a random beggar trying to sound wise. But then, everything around him started to shift, and not in his favor. It began with a leaked scandal, one he had nothing to do with, yet his name was plastered all over the media. The press accused Carter Enterprises of insider trading, sending stockholders into a panic. Then came the betrayal. His most trusted business partner, Richard Hawthorne, a man Damian had once considered his closest ally, was exposed for embezzlement. Millions vanished from company accounts overnight. But the world didn't blame Richard, they blamed Damian. A whisper of corruption turned into a storm. The media tore him apart, his name dragged through endless headlines, ruthless speculations, and damning reports. Within weeks, his empire began to collapse. Lawsuits, investors pulling out, board members turning their backs on him. And then, the final blow, Vanessa. The woman he had planned to marry, the woman who had clung to his arm at every social event professing loyalty and admiration, stood before him in their penthouse, her arms crossed, her expression cold. "I can't do this, Damian." She took a slow sip of her wine. "You're a sinking ship, and I refuse to go down with you." Damian stared at her, his jaw tight. "So that's it? Just like that?" She sighed, exasperated. "You think I fell in love with you?" "Oh, sweetheart." She let out a soft chuckle, stepping closer. "I fell in love with your money, your power, and now that it's all slipping away, tell me, what do you have left?" He had no answer, because for the first time in his life, he truly had nothing. She left that night, no hesitation, no remorse. And as Damian stood there, watching her disappear, something inside him shattered. He had everything, now he had nothing. Maybe that beggar woman had been right all along. It rained that night, cold, unforgiving. Damian walked without a destination. His once pristine black suit was drenched, his tie undone, his heart hollow in a way he had never known. He had spent his entire life believing power was everything, that wealth could protect him from loss, from pain, from vulnerability. How wrong he had been. And then, there she was, the same woman, the one who had haunted his thoughts. She stood beneath a dimly lit street lamp, her shawl wrapped tightly around her fragile frame, staring at him as if she had been expecting him. Damian felt something shift inside him. How ironic. His voice was rough, heavy with the weight of the night. He took a slow step toward her, his icy blue eyes locking onto her deep brown ones. "The last time we met, you told me I was the poorest man you'd ever seen." She didn't respond, just watched him with that same knowing expression. "Congratulations," Damian let out a humorless laugh. "Now I actually am." For the first time, her expression softened, not with pity, but with something deeper. "No, Damian." She stepped closer, her voice quieter now. "Now you're finally rich enough to understand what truly matters." Something inside him tightened. He was a man who had faced ruthless business rivals, corporate betrayals, and countless failures. Yet, standing in front of this woman, a woman who had nothing to her name but wisdom, he felt small, weak, vulnerable, drawn to her in a way that terrified him. He let out a bitter chuckle. "I don't even know your name." A small, almost amused smile touched her lips. "Elena. Elena." It suited her. Mysterious, elegant, full of secrets. She glanced at the bench nearby, motioning for him to sit, and for some reason, he did. He, Damian Carter, a man who once ruled an empire, now sitting beside a beggar in the rain. And somehow, it felt more real than anything he had ever known. For the first time in his life, Damian truly talked. Not about business, not about power, but about pain. About the betrayal, the emptiness, the loneliness he never admitted, not even to himself. And Elena? She listened. Not because she wanted anything from him, not because she needed his money, but because she saw him, the real him. And that was dangerous. Somewhere between the hushed words and the stormy night, something shifted between them. He felt it. She felt it. A strange, undeniable pull. Damian's gaze dropped to her lips. Soft, untouched by luxury, yet more alluring than any woman he had ever known. The air between them thickened. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Rougher. Eleanor's eyes held his, unflinching. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything, and because—" She hesitated. Then, almost too softly, "because I see something in you. Something you're too afraid to see in yourself." Something burned in his chest. Something he didn't understand. Something that felt too much like longing. Before he could say another word, she stood. "Come with me," she said simply. Damian stared at her. "Where?" Eleanor smiled. "Somewhere you'll find what you've been missing all along." He should have said no. He should have walked away. But he didn't. Because for the first time in his life, he wanted to know what it meant to be truly rich. And for that, he needed her. For the first time in his life, Damian Carter, the billionaire who once dictated the fate of corporations, the man who controlled economies with a signature, found himself powerless. Powerless to his circumstances, powerless to his emotions, powerless in front of Elena. She led him through the narrow, dimly lit streets, where the scent of freshly baked bread mixed with the musty odour of rain-soaked pavement. It was a world he had never known, a world where people greeted each other not with polished smiles and hidden agendas, but with genuine warmth. A world where money wasn't the currency, kindness was. Damian walked beside her, his expensive shoes scuffing against uneven sidewalks. His once pristine suit was wrinkled and damp from the rain, his hair slightly dishevelled. For the first time, he didn't look like a billionaire. He looked human. "Where are we going?" he finally asked, stealing a glance at her. Eleanor, wrapped in her threadbare shawl, smiled without looking at him. "To a place where you'll learn what it means to truly live." Something about her unnerved him. She wasn't like the people he knew, the ones who either feared him, admired him, or wanted something from him. Elena didn't ask for anything. She didn't expect anything. And that terrified him. They finally arrived at a small hidden shelter tucked between two old buildings. Inside, the scent of hot soup filled the air. Children ran barefoot across the wooden floor, their laughter echoing through the space. Damian stood frozen at the entrance, his gaze sweeping over the people. Men, women, children, sharing meals, helping one another, offering smiles despite having nothing. "You live here?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Elena nodded, her gaze soft as a little boy ran into her arms. "This is home." Something inside him twisted. This question mark, this was her life. She could have been anywhere else, could have begged on the streets, manipulated people for money, but instead, she chose to give. And for the first time, Damian Carter, a man who had been surrounded by the finest luxuries all his life, felt unbearably small. The next few days challenged everything Damian thought he knew. He had once believed that money could solve anything, that power could protect him, that emotions made a man weak. But here, power meant nothing. Here, the strongest man wasn't the one who controlled wealth. It was the one who gave up his own meal so that a starving child could eat. Here, people didn't judge him for his past. They accepted him as he was now. And the most terrifying part? Here, Damian wasn't the man he used to be. For the first time, he worked with his hands, carrying sacks of rice, fixing broken chairs, serving food to those who had nothing. At first, it was unbearable. He hated the dirt under his nails, the soreness in his muscles, the way people thanked him as if he were their equal. He wasn't their equal. Was he? And then, Elena. She was always there, guiding him, watching him struggle but never offering to make it easier, never pitying him, never treating him as anything more or less than a man. And somewhere between the late-night conversations under flickering shelter lights, between the stolen glances across the dinner table, something shifted between them. One evening, as Damian sat on the wooden floor helping a little girl tie her shoelace, he felt Elena's eyes on him. When he looked up, she was staring at him, not with amusement, not with judgment, but with something different, something that made his heart stumble. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally she said, "You're changing." He swallowed, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. "Am I?" She nodded, stepping closer. "You may not see it yet, but I do." His throat felt tight. For the first time in his life, Damian wasn't sure who he was anymore. And that night, after the others had fallen asleep, Damian found Elena sitting outside the shelter staring at the stars. He hesitated before sitting beside her. For a moment they just sat there, silent. The world around them was quiet. The stars above burned like distant memories. "You don't belong here," he finally said, breaking the silence. Elena smiled. "Neither do you." He turned to look at her. Really look at her. The moonlight cast a soft glow on her face, highlighting the gentle curves of her cheek, the delicate arch of her lips. And then, before he could stop himself, he reached out. His fingers brushed against her cheek. Light, hesitant, testing, feeling, wanting. Elena stiffened slightly, her breath catching. "Damian," she whispered. It was the way she said his name, software almost reverent, as if it was something precious. As if he was something precious. His hand slid lower, tracing the line of her jaw. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. She didn't move away, but she didn't lean in either. Instead, she placed her hand over his, stopping him, not forcefully, not out of rejection, but out of something deeper, something that made his chest ache. "You don't know what you want yet," she murmured, "and I won't be something you take just because you're lost." Her words felt like a punch to the gut, because she was right. He wanted her. He wanted this. But was it because she was different, or because he was desperate to fill the emptiness inside him? He didn't know, and Elena wouldn't let him touch her until he did. So, slowly, painfully, he pulled back. But as she turned her face away, as the cool night air settled between them, Damian made himself a silent promise. He would find out what he truly wanted, and when he did, he wouldn't let her go. Days passed, then weeks, and with each moment, Damian Carter was no longer the man he used to be. He was no longer the ruthless billionaire who believed the world revolved around power and money, no longer the cold, emotionally detached businessman who saw people as transactions. Because now, he had Elena. She had become his guiding light, the only person who had ever looked at him and seen more than his wealth. And he had fallen for her, deeply, irrevocably, painfully. He knew it in the way his heart raced whenever she smiled at him. He knew it in the way he craved her presence, her laughter, her warmth. He knew it in the way his world felt unbearably empty whenever she wasn't near. But Eleanor never let him get too close. Every time his hand brushed against hers, every time his gaze lingered on her lips, she pulled away. And it was driving him insane. Damian had never had to fight for a woman before. Women had always come to him, offering themselves freely, begging for his attention, desperate to be the one who captured his heart. But Eleanor? She resisted, and that only made him want her more. Until one night, he discovered the truth, and everything changed. It happened by accident. Damian had been helping at the shelter, something that had now become a part of his life. He no longer did it out of guilt. He did it because he wanted to, because it made him feel something real. That evening, as he was cleaning up, he overheard a group of older men talking in hushed voices. "She was once one of them, you know," one man said, his voice laced with sadness. "Rich, beautiful, a woman who had everything. And then she lost it all," another sighed, "because of love, because of a man who betrayed her." Damian's body froze, his heart stilled. They were talking about Elena. "She was married to the son of a powerful family," the first man continued, "a wealthy businessman. But he threw her away, framed her for a crime she didn't commit, took everything from her, left her with nothing. She could have fought back," the other added, "but she didn't. She walked away from it all." Damian's blood turned to ice. Eleanor had been rich. Eleanor had been married. And suddenly, everything made sense. Her sad smiles, her quiet wisdom, the way she carried herself, not like a beggar, but like someone who had once been something more. The way she never let him get too close. She wasn't just a woman who had lost everything. She was a woman who had loved and been betrayed. And that realization shattered him. That night, he found her sitting alone on the rooftop of the shelter, staring at the stars. She always did that. Stared at the sky as if searching for something she had lost. Damian stepped forward, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. "You should have told me." Eleanor stiffened. She knew. Slowly she turned to face him, her dark eyes guarded. "Told you what?" "Everything." His voice was low, intense. "That you weren't always living this life, that you once had wealth, that you once had love." Eleanor's expression didn't change. "And why does it matter, Damian?" His jaw tightened. "Because He exhaled sharply, running a frustrated hand through his hair. "Because I care, Elena. More than I should. More than I can control." A shadow crossed her face, but she didn't look surprised. She had known. She had always known what he felt for her. "Damian." Her voice was softer now, but there was a sadness to it. "You don't want me." His hands clenched into fists. "How the hell do you know what I want?" Eleanor looked away, her voice barely a whisper. "Because I've already lived this story once, and I know how it ends." A sharp pain stabbed through his chest. "You think I'm like him?" His voice was rough, filled with anger, but not at her, at whoever had broken her. Eleanor swallowed hard. "I think you don't know what love is yet, and I can't be the one who teaches you." That hurt more than anything. Damian took a step closer, closing the distance between them, his presence overwhelming. "Then tell me, Elena." His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "If I don't know what love is? Why does my heart ache every time you look at me?" Her breath hitched. "If I don't know what love is, why do I dream about you? Why do I crave your touch? Why do I want nothing in this world but to make you smile?" A storm brewed in her eyes. She wanted to fight it. She wanted to push him away. But she couldn't, because she felt it too. Damian reached out, cupping her face in his hands, his touch gentle but desperate. "Tell me you don't feel the same," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "Tell me, and I'll walk away." Eleanor's lips parted, her breathing ragged. She couldn't, because she did feel it. More than she should, more than she could control. But she had already been burned by love before, and she wasn't sure she could survive it again. So, with a trembling breath, she stepped back. Damian's hands fell away, and his heart shattered. "I can't," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "I can't do this, Damian." And before he could say another word, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone, with nothing but the unbearable weight of love unspoken. Damian couldn't sleep. For the first time in his life, he had everything he truly wanted within his grasp. And she walked away. Elena, the woman who had saved him without even trying. The woman who had shown him the truth about himself, about life, about love. She had taught him how to live, when all he had known was survival. And now, she was slipping through his fingers. His body ached with longing. His heart throbbed with emotions he wasn't used to feeling, but he wasn't about to let her go. Not without a fight. For the first time in his life, Damian Carter wasn't chasing money. He wasn't chasing power. He was chasing love. By the time the sun rose, Elena was gone. She had disappeared from the shelter, vanished like a ghost in the morning mist. Damian's panic was immediate. She was out there, alone, in a world that had already broken her once, and he wouldn't let it break her again. So he searched, everywhere. He asked the people at the shelter, the street vendors who knew her, the shopkeepers who had seen her before. But no one knew where she had gone, and with every moment that passed, his chest grew tighter, his heart grew heavier. He had never been afraid of losing anything before, because nothing had ever meant this much. But now he was terrified, because this wasn't about money, or business, or power. This was about her, his Elena. The 3 days, 3 days of searching, 3 days of losing hope, 3 days of aching for her, until finally, he found her. She was sitting on a quiet bench in a secluded park, her arms wrapped around herself, her dark hair falling over her face. She looked lost, just like he had been. Damian's breath hitched as he walked toward her, his heartbeat pounding in his chest. She didn't notice him at first, too deep in her own thoughts. But then, she felt him. Her body tensed as she looked up, and the moment her eyes met his, everything else faded. Damian didn't speak at first. He just looked at her. Looked at the woman who had changed him, saved him, made him believe in something greater than himself. And then, he did something he had never done before. He knelt in front of her, right there, on the cold pavement, in the middle of the park. The billionaire who had once ruled the world knelt before the woman who had taught him what love truly meant. "Damian," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. His hands found hers, holding them as if he were afraid she would slip away again. "I love you," he said, his voice raw, unfiltered, filled with a depth of emotion he had never known. Elena froze. Damian had never said those words to anyone before. Not to his past lovers, not even to his family. But now he said them with everything inside him. "I don't care about your past, Elena. I don't care about what happened before. All I care about is you." Now with me. Tears welled in her eyes. Damian, I can't. I'm broken. He shook his head, squeezing her hands tighter. You're not broken. You're the strongest person I've ever met. And I don't want a perfect woman, Elena. I want you. Her breath hitched, her body trembling. I don't want to be something you fix, Damian. His gaze softened, and for the first time his eyes weren't empty. They were full. Then just be something I love. Elena let out a soft, broken sob, her walls crumbling. And then she fell into his arms. And Damian held her, as if he would never let go. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him, his fingers tracing her jaw with a touch so gentle, so reverent it made her chest tighten. And then he kissed her, not out of desperation, not out of lust, not out of fleeting attraction, but out of love. Deep, consuming, earth-shattering love. Elena melted into him, her hands fisting his shirt, her lips parting beneath his as a soft, breathless moan escaped her throat. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not their pasts, not their scars, not their fears. Only this, only them, only love. Damian didn't take her back to a penthouse. He didn't shower her with diamonds or expensive gifts, because that wasn't love. Instead, he built something with her. Together, they turned the shelter into a home for those who needed it most. Together, they used Damian's wealth for something greater than himself. And together, they created a love neither of them had ever thought possible. One that wasn't built on money, power, or transactions, but on something far more valuable, something that made him the richest man in the world. Her. One evening, as they sat on the rooftop of the shelter watching the sunset, Damian pulled Elena close, and with a soft, unshakable certainty he whispered, I was once the richest man in the world, but knew nothing about love. You were once poor, but you taught me everything about life. Now, I have both, you and wisdom. That makes me the richest of all. Elena smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. And then she kissed him again. Not because he had won her over, not because he had fought for her, but because she had fallen for him too, hopelessly, deeply, unconditionally. And this time, she wouldn't walk away. Because Damian Carter wasn't just the man she had saved. He was the man she had always been meant to love. The sun had just begun to set over the city, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The world moved on as it always did, cars honking, people hurrying, lives rushing forward, but on the rooftop of the shelter time seemed to stand still. Damian sat beside Elena, his arm draped around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. The warmth of her body against his was the only comfort he had ever truly known. For the first time in his life, he didn't need anything else. No luxury, no power, no fortune, just her. Do you ever regret it? Damian asked, his voice low as his fingers traced lazy circles on her arm. Elena lifted her head, her dark eyes searching his. Regret what? Walking away from the life you once had. He hesitated before adding, the wealth, the luxury, the things I used to believe mattered. Elena smiled, the kind of smile that had once haunted him, but now it healed him. I didn't walk away from wealth, Damian. She turned, gently cupping his face. I walked away from emptiness. His heart tightened at her words, because he knew what that emptiness felt like. It had been his entire existence before her. And yet, here they were, two souls who had lost everything, only to find each other. Over the next few months, everything changed. Damian didn't return to his old life, at least not in the same way. He used his wealth, not to build an empire, but to build a purpose. With Elena by his side, he created a foundation, one that helped those who had nowhere else to turn. Shelters, schools, hospitals. He had once built skyscrapers that touched the sky. Now he was building lives that touched the stars, and it was all because of her. One evening, Damian took Elena back to the place where their story had begun. The street where she had first spoken those haunting words to him. The street lamp flickered as the wind whispered through the night. The memory of that moment was still fresh in his mind. And now, as Elena stood before him, his heart pounded with a different kind of urgency. "You once told me I was the poorest man you'd ever seen," he murmured, stepping closer. Elena's lips parted, emotion flickering in her eyes. "I remember." Damian smiled, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full. "You were right." Elena sucked in a breath as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a simple but beautiful ring. The moment her eyes landed on it, she gasped. "Damian." He sank down onto one knee, his hands slightly trembling, because she was the only thing in the world that had ever made him nervous. "I don't need wealth to be rich. I don't need power to be whole. I only need you, Elena. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Her hand flew to her mouth, tears already pooling in her eyes. "So tell me, my love, will you marry me?" A small broken sob escaped her lips. And then she nodded. "Yes, Damian." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was the only answer he needed. As he slid the ring onto her finger, he knew. This wasn't just the end of a chapter, it was the beginning of a forever. Their wedding was nothing like the extravagant ceremonies Damian had once attended. No lavish ballrooms, no golden chandeliers, no cameras flashing. Instead, they married in the very shelter where their love had blossomed. The people who had become their family, the children, the elderly, the ones who had nothing, were now their guests. Elena walked toward him in a simple white dress, her dark eyes glowing with unshed tears. And Damian? He had never seen anything more beautiful. As they stood before each other, hands clasped, vows whispered, promises sealed, there was no doubt. This was love in its purest form. No wealth, no expectations, no conditions, just two souls forever intertwined. And when Damian kissed his bride, he knew. He had finally found what he had been searching for all his life. Not power, not money, not status, but love. And that made him the richest man in the world. And one evening, long after their wedding, Elena sat beside Damian on the rooftop of the shelter watching the sunset. The world had changed, but one thing had remained constant: her presence beside him. Damian gently took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. And in that moment, he whispered the words he had never imagined saying. "I once believed I had everything, then I lost it all. But when I found you, I realized I had never been rich until now." Elena smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "Then don't ever let me go, Damian." He turned, pressing a kiss to her forehead, his heart swelling with a love greater than anything he had ever known. "Never, my love. Never." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting them in a golden glow, they knew. Their love story had only just begun, because true love never fades. It only grows.